Okay, here we go. This is a fairly long lecture on the steps to division and the succession crisis. I'll be talking about events of the 1850s that go along with party realignment, the Dred Scott Supreme Court decision, the Lincoln Douglas debates, John Brown's raid in Harper's Ferry, and the election of 1860, which leads directly to the secession of Southern states, the formation of the Confederacy, and the outbreak of the war itself. So I look upon party realignment as perhaps the most important thing that happened to in the division, and the parties could no longer accommodate the interests of the North and the South. And the interests of the North were catalyzed by the publication of Uncle Tom's Cabin by Harriet Beecher Stowe in 1852 and 53. The book itself was serialized in Harper's Weekly and had a readership hanging on every chapter. And so these kind of melodramatic scenes of Eliza running across the ice floes to escape the slave catchers, and Uncle Tom being whipped to death by the evil Simon Legree, all of that drove home the point that slaves were people, that they had real feelings, real families, and white people had not had that before. So that increased the attention around slavery. The Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854, pushed through by Illinois Senator Stephen Douglas as a result of his interest in the Northern Railroad. He wanted to have a railroad that went across Nebraska with Chicago as its eastern terminus going out to the West Coast. Well, to organize the land, you had to politically decide what you wanted to do with slavery. And the Kansas-Nebraska Act said that popular sovereignty would be allowed in Kansas and Nebraska. But this would have repealed the Missouri Compromise of 1820, which outlawed slavery in all of Kansas and Nebraska. So this was, he did this to get Southern votes for his proposal, and he got them. So the Kansas-Nebraska Act was passed in 1854. Well, this led to the disintegration of the Whig political party and the emergence of the Republican Party as an anti-Nebraska pro-free soil party that would emerge in 1855 and 56 as Kansas became bleeding Kansas of 1855. People were no longer coolly deciding whether they wanted to have slavery or not. They were shooting people over the issue, and it was becoming very divisive. So this was the result of the Kansas-Nebraska Act. There shows the map of free and slave state interests over different moments in our history. This shows the election of 1848 with a Whig victory for General Taylor, as you can see in the election, but that was the last election the Whigs won. In 1852, they were down to winning just a few states. And in 1856, they had pretty much disappeared from the landscape. There wasn't a Whig party. There was a Republican Party in the North that was running John C. Fremont as a candidate. So the Dred Scott decision was handed down by Chief Justice Roger Taney in 1857. And in this decision, where Dred Scott sued for his freedom based on the fact that his master had brought him to free states once, Taney pretty much threw out the case and let the lower court ruling stand. And 9 times out of 10, that's all that the Supreme Court will do when they throw out a case like this. Rules that Scott didn't have standing. But Taney said in the case that a black man has no rights that a white man is bound to respect. And by saying this, he more or less denied citizenship for African Americans, said that the Constitution had always meant to exclude African Americans. Well, this was crazy historical reasoning and bad constitutional history, but it became the law of the land as the Dred Scott decision went into effect. He further said that it was the Missouri Compromise line excluding slavery was unconstitutional, that you cannot deny a person to the right to enjoy their property without due process of law. So he ruled that the Missouri Compromise line, and therefore any restriction on slavery, was something the federal government should not be a party to. And this was pretty scary for non-slave owners at the time. So Lincoln ran against Douglas for the Senate seat of Illinois in 1858. And the main issue was slavery expansion in this election, which made Lincoln fairly famous around the country, made him a household name. Lincoln gave his famous House Divided speech, which scared the heck out of the South because it was a veiled threat against slavery. Lincoln said that he felt there would probably be a day where the Union was no longer going to have slave states. Douglas won the election but lost the South with this Freeport Doctrine. In Freeport, Illinois, you see it here in the map on the north of Illinois, Lincoln asked Douglas how he could square his ideas of popular sovereignty with the Dred Scott case, which said that you can't restrict a slavery expansion from the territories. And the Freeport Doctrine was Douglas's response, where he said that states could refuse to enact slave codes. Technically, you can't get rid of slavery, but if you refuse to enact slave codes, it's as good as abolishing slavery there altogether. And this made the South very angry that you could find a way around the Dred Scott case to keep the country, the slavery out of that state. So it was very controversial. John Brown's raid is very simple. It took place in late 1859 and frightened Southerners a lot. Here was an abolitionist coming to lead the slaves in a revolt against slavery. And This frightened them very much that here was a real tangible proof that these abolitionists were coming to kill them in their beds. It frightened them. So the election of 1860 was a four-way race. The Democrats split into a northern candidacy under Stephen Douglas and a southern candidacy under John Breckinridge. The Constitutional Union emerged during the election to stand for the Union itself, and they ran John Bell as their candidate. The Republicans nominated Abraham Lincoln for the presidency. Pretty much a surprise, everyone's second or third choice, but he became the nominee. They stood, the Republicans, against the expansion of slavery into the territories. That's the old thing. And this commitment to the old Whig policies of Henry Clay, of a national bank, of its spending on internal improvements, of a high protective tariff. Clay was Lincoln's hero, and the Republicans wrote a platform reflecting that honoring of those issues. Well, the Republicans won the election, as you can see. As you can see, Lincoln didn't even get 40% of the popular vote, but he got a majority in the Electoral College and so was elected president, fair and square. The Republicans thought the South didn't really mean it when they threatened to secede, that President Lincoln would be a president for all the people. But as they began to leave the Union, they began to see that the southern states were in earnest. South Carolina was the first slave state to leave the Union in December of 1860. Lincoln still wasn't going to be president until early March, but South Carolina said that his election was enough for them to leave the Union. Others followed quickly. There were 7 states that left the Union by February of 1861. You had a fairly close election in a number of states. Georgia went 55-45 in favor of immediate secession, but there were 45% of Georgians who basically said, let's wait a while and see what the government does. Well, they formed the Confederate States of America in early February of 1861 out of these 7 states. There were still, at this point, 8 slave states that remained part of the Union that refused to secede at the time. Now, there were efforts at compromise of trying to put the country back together. The Crittenden Compromise was the most famous of them. And this said 2 things. One, we're going to pass an amendment that guarantees slavery forever in the seceding states, a new 13th Amendment, which would protect slavery. And Lincoln was fine with that. He could go with that. But the other part of the Crittenden Compromise was drawing the 3630 line out to the Pacific Ocean and allowing slavery south of that line. And Lincoln would not go along with that. That would have been to extend slavery into the territory. And he basically said, that he could not support the compromise because it had that provision. So his first inaugural address stated that Southern states should come back into the Union, that the Union would not attack them. Please come back. But he knew that Fort Sumter in Charleston Harbor was running out of food and that the governor would not let a resupply ship land at Fort Sumter. So as soon as they bombed Fort Sumter and caused it to surrender and give up its claims, 4 more slave states left the Union and sided with the Confederacy in response to an actual shooting war having broken out in the country. Lincoln reacted by calling for 75,000 volunteers to serve for 3 months, pretty optimistic about putting down the rebellion. He suspended the writ of habeas corpus. He arrested officials in Maryland. He basically did what he had to do as a dictator, more or less, to make sure that the border state of Maryland remained in the Union and that Washington, D.C. was not in the middle of states that claims to be another government. So the Battle of Bull Run that took place in July of 1861, or Manassas, my favorite album, by the way, was fought when the 3-month enlistment was about to run up for the 75,000 volunteers. And the Battle of Bull Run was the Southern victory. It was one day, and it resulted in the North coming to realize that the war was going to be very long and very bloody and would demand a whole bunch of treasure and effort from the North that they had not anticipated at the outbreak of hostilities. But this battle gave a clear signal that the war was going to be a long one. Okay, that's all we have on this lecture. Thank you very much.